pregnant and humiliated in public. She believed no one would have the courage to defend her, until a mysterious man took the first step. What began as discreet gestures transformed into a bond capable of defying prejudices, healing wounds, and rekindling hope. A story of love, courage, and new beginnings. Prepare to be moved. Subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain pounded the rooftops of the small town of Flower Ridge, creating a gray curtain that seemed as heavy as Helena's heart. The water drops fell on her already soaked coat, mixing with the tears she could no longer contain. There, in the middle of the central square, in front of the town's busiest bakery, Paul had just done what he knew how to do best: humiliate her. "Do you really think you can hide that belly?" he shouted, pulling off her coat and exposing the small 5-month bump. "Do you think I'm stupid enough to believe that child is mine?" People passed by, slowed their pace, looked. Some pretended not to see. Others didn't even try to disguise their morbid curiosity. Helena tasted the metallic flavor of blood when she bit her own lip, trying to control the tremor that dominated her body. It wasn't just shame that paralyzed her, but the terrible realization that in this town where she had grown up, there wasn't a single face willing to intervene. The silence of acquaintances hurt more than her husband's words. "You're crazy," was all she managed to say, her voice coming out more like a broken whisper than the defense she intended it to be. Paul approached, his breath hot with coffee, mixed with the sour smell of morning alcohol. "Crazy? Me? Who's carrying a child no one knows who fathered, and I'm the crazy one?" The smell of freshly baked bread that normally brought comfort now seemed like cruel irony. Helena looked around one last time, searching for some sign of support, some look of understanding. That's when she noticed across the street, partially covered by the old bookstore's awning, a tall man watching her intently. It wasn't a look of judgment or curiosity, but something different. There was a kind of silent understanding she couldn't explain. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The stranger made a subtle movement, as if he were going to cross the street, but Helena quickly pulled her coat from Paul's hands and walked away at a rapid pace, leaving behind not only her husband, but the last drop of hope that her life in that town could be rebuilt. What she didn't know was that this brief meeting of gazes would change everything, and that the man standing in the rain, Edward Mitchell, wasn't just the solitary owner of the region's largest lands. He was someone who, like her, knew the weight of silence when everyone turns their backs. Edward Mitchell watched the woman walk away in the rain, noticing the dignity with which she tried to keep her shoulders up, despite the public humiliation. Something in that scene had touched him deeply, as if he were witnessing an echo of his own story. At 38, Edward was what the town called the reclusive millionaire. Heir to the lands that surrounded much of Flower Ridge, including the region's largest flower greenhouse, he rarely participated in social events. Most residents knew him only by his austere profile and the stories that circulated about his anonymous generosity. Few knew that behind that man of impeccable posture and always controlled expression was someone who had chosen isolation after a painful family estrangement that had marked him 10 years before. Edward entered the bookstore, pretending interest in any book while his mind remained on the square scene. The treatment that woman had received triggered memories he preferred to keep dormant: rejection, judgment, loneliness, imposed not by choice, but by circumstance. "Difficult girl, Helena," commented the bookstore owner, a gray-haired lady who seemed to know every inhabitant of the town. Always was reserved, but after she married that Paul, well, she practically disappeared. Edward feigned disinterest, but the lady continued. A marriage that began like a fairy tale and ended like a tragedy. Now she's on her own, pregnant, and he's out there, telling anyone who will listen that the child isn't his. And is it? The question escaped before Edward could contain it. The lady smiled, adjusting her glasses. "That girl is incapable of betraying anyone, Mr. Mitchell. The problem is that no one here has the courage to confront Paul. His family owns the only market in town. Nobody wants to cause trouble." Edward nodded, leaving some bills on the counter for the book he hadn't even properly leafed through. He went back out into the rain, his face marked by a determination he hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was time to leave his seclusion, even if for a brief moment, even if for someone he didn't even know. Helena closed the door of her house with difficulty, feeling the weight of the day in every inch of her body. The small cottage she rented on the outskirts of town was modest, but clean and welcoming. The only place where she could breathe without feeling the town's eyes on her. There were flowers in small pots in almost every corner, her small form of resistance, creating beauty amid chaos. She leaned against the door and finally allowed the sobs to come. Her body slid down to the floor while she hugged her own belly, as if she could protect her baby not only from the outside world, but also from her own sadness. "Everything will be fine," she whispered, a promise she repeated every day, without knowing how she would fulfill it. Her savings were running out, and the embroidery orders she received weren't enough to support herself, let alone a child. Paul had refused to offer any kind of help, and her family, embarrassed by the situation, kept their distance, sending small amounts without ever really asking what she needed. Helena felt a gentle movement in her womb. It was as if the baby responded to her promise with a gentle reminder of its presence. That sensation, still so new, brought a tremulous smile to her lips. No matter how uncertain the future seemed, there was a life growing inside her, trusting in her, depending on her. She stood up with renewed determination. Tomorrow would be market day, and she would take her embroidery to sell. It didn't matter what Paul said or how people looked at her. She would find a way. She had to find one. What Helena didn't know was that, miles away, in a mansion surrounded by fields of flowers, Edward Mitchell was watching the rain through his office window, thinking about the woman he had seen in the square and how, for the first time in years, he had felt the impulse to interfere in someone's life. The weekly market of Flower Ridge took place every Wednesday in the central square, where producers, artisans, and local merchants displayed their goods. It was a social event as much as a commercial one, the place where news was exchanged, gossip confirmed, and reputations built or destroyed. Helena arrived early, setting up in a discreet corner with her embroidery carefully organized. Her pieces were known for the delicacy of their stitches and the use of floral motifs that seemed almost alive. Few people in the region had her skill with needle and thread, but in recent months, since the separation had become the town's favorite topic, her sales had decreased considerably. The first hours passed slowly. Helena watched people approach her small table, admire her work, and upon recognizing her, walk away with polite excuses. By noon, she hadn't sold a single piece, and discouragement was beginning to weigh on her shoulders. That's when she noticed Edward Mitchell walking among the stalls. Unlike the other inhabitants who always seemed hurried and noisy, he moved with an almost studied tranquility, stopping here and there to examine products, exchange a few words with vendors. He wore simple, but evidently quality clothes, dark pants, light linen shirt, without flaunting the wealth everyone knew he possessed. Helena lowered her gaze when she realized he was approaching her table. She still remembered the man from the rain, the look they had exchanged, and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Good morning." His voice was deep and controlled, without the false sympathy she was used to receiving. "Are these your embroideries?" Helena raised her eyes, meeting his, a deep brown that seemed to observe her with genuine interest. "Yes, sir. Each piece is handmade." Edward picked up one of the tablecloths, examining the details with attention. "This is star jasmine, isn't it? Rarely seen in this region except in greenhouses." Helena couldn't hide her surprise. "You know flowers." An almost smile appeared on his face. "It's my business, after all." He put the tablecloth back and examined other pieces. "I'll take these 3. He pointed to the most elaborate and, consequently, most expensive pieces. Helena hesitated. "Mr. Mitchell, you don't need to." "I do need to," he interrupted gently. "I'm renovating the guest house, and these pieces fit perfectly with the decoration I have in mind." It was a transparent lie, but said with such naturalness that Helena didn't have the courage to contest it. While she wrapped the pieces, Edward observed her hands, small, with calluses on the fingertips, but firm and precise in every movement. "I heard you have special talent with plants too," he commented, apparently casual. Helena finished packing the tablecloths before responding. My mother was a gardener. I learned some things from her. I'm looking for someone to help in the greenhouse, especially now with the flower festival approaching. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. It would be temporary work, but well paid. Helena felt her heart accelerate. A job at the Mitchell greenhouse would be not only the solution to her financial problems, but also a chance to work with what she really loved. However, years of disappointments had built walls around her heart. Why me? She asked, the distrust evident in her voice. There are more qualified people in town. Edward handed her some bills, much more than the value of the embroideries. Because you embroidered a star jasmine with botanical perfection, something only someone who really knows plants would be able to do. He pocketed the package and added, as if it were an afterthought, and because I believe in second chances. Before Helena could respond, a shrill voice sounded behind them. Well, what do we have here? The hill hermit finally descending to the level of common people? Paul approached, the smell of alcohol emanating from him even at that hour of the morning. Helena felt her stomach turn. Go away, Paul, I'm working. Working? He laughed, looking from Helena to Edward. Is that what they call it now? Edward turned slowly, facing Paul with an unreadable expression. Mr. Williams, isn't it? Owner of the market on the corner of Maple Street. Paul seemed momentarily disarmed by the formality. Yes, why? I'm considering buying the adjacent lot, but I'm concerned about the quality of the neighborhood. Each word was said with deliberate calm, the polite tone contrasting with the implicit threat. Paul's face paled. The market was his livelihood, and the simple idea of having Edward Mitchell as a neighbor, possibly opening a competing establishment, was terrifying. I was just passing by to say hello, he mumbled, backing away a few steps. Helena, we'll talk later. When Paul walked away, Helena looked at Edward with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Thank you, but you didn't need to do that. I did nothing but make an observation about business. Edward handed her a card. If you're interested in the greenhouse job, come tomorrow at 9. The address is there. He walked away before she could respond, leaving her with an elegant card in her hands and a difficult decision ahead. The path to the Mitchell property was long and winding, climbing up the mountainside that gave the town its name. Helena took the only bus that made that route, feeling the curious looks of the other passengers. News traveled fast in Flower Ridge, and her conversation with Edward at the market must already be a topic in every house. The road serpentined between fields of wildflowers that grew naturally, creating a multicolored carpet that extended as far as the eye could see. As the bus climbed, the landscape changed. The first greenhouses appeared, glass structures that gleamed in the morning sun, protecting rare and delicate species from the inconstant mountain climate. Helena got off at the final stop, still a good walk from the main entrance. She adjusted the simple dress she had chosen, one of the few that still fit her comfortably with her growing belly, and followed the dirt road. With each step, she questioned her decision. Was she really ready to accept help, especially from a man she barely knew? Wouldn't it just be another form of dependence like it had been with Paul? Her thoughts were interrupted when she reached the immense wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to the property. She hesitated for a moment before pressing the bell. Can I help you? A female voice sounded through the intercom. My name is Helena Fields. I have an appointment with Mr. Mitchell about the greenhouse job. There was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of the gate opening automatically. Helena took a deep breath and entered, walking down an avenue lined with yellow IP trees that formed a golden canopy over her head. The main house appeared after a curve, an imposing two-story construction with wide verandas and tall windows. It wasn't ostentatious as Helena had imagined, but elegant in its simplicity, perfectly integrated with the surrounding nature. Meticulously cared for gardens surrounded the house, with stone fountains and benches strategically positioned among flower beds. Before she could reach the entrance stairway, Helena saw Edward coming out of one of the side greenhouses. He wore work pants and a shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, very different from the polished image he presented in town. There was dirt on his hands and a moisture stain on the front of his shirt. You came, he said, and Helena couldn't help but notice a slight tone of surprise in his voice. I haven't accepted the job yet, she responded with more firmness than she felt. I came to learn more about the proposal. Edward smiled, and Helena realized it was the first time she had seen him do so, a genuine smile that softened his normally serious features. Fair enough. Come, I'll show you the main greenhouse. He guided her along a stone path between perfectly maintained gardens until they reached an impressive structure. A dome-shaped greenhouse, much larger than the others, with glass panels that allowed controlled entry of sunlight. This is the dome, as we call it, explained Edward, opening the double door. Our most ambitious project. The air inside the greenhouse was humid and perfumed, an intoxicating mixture of floral fragrances. Helena immediately felt at home, enveloped by that world of colors and textures. They walked through corridors formed by elevated benches, where species grew that she had only seen in books. Rare orchids, exotic bromeliads, flowers from tropical regions that wouldn't survive naturally in the mountain climate. It's wonderful, she murmured, momentarily forgetting her reserve. The project is for this year's flower festival, explained Edward, watching her attentively. We're trying to cultivate species that normally don't bloom at the same time to create impossible arrangements. A celebration of diversity, of the coexistence of what shouldn't coexist. There was something in the way he said those words that made Helena look at him more carefully. It wasn't just about flowers. There was a life philosophy there. And where would I fit into this project? Edward led her to a separate section of the greenhouse, where small and apparently fragile seedlings were cultivated in special containers. These are our most delicate seedlings, varieties we're trying to acclimatize. They need constant care, humidity adjustments, temperature. Gerald, our specialist, had to be absent for family reasons. We need someone with sensitivity to take over this section. Helena approached the seedlings, examining them with trained eyes. This one here has excess water, she commented, lightly touching a yellowed leaf. And that one needs more indirect light. Edward observed her in silence, his face revealing satisfaction. That's exactly why I thought of you. He paused. The work would be Monday to Friday, 9 to 4. Saturdays only half day. Above average local salary, with benefits including health insurance, and if you prefer, we can provide transportation. It was more than Helena expected, more than she could dream of in that difficult moment of her life. But one question still bothered her. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. Edward kept his gaze fixed on the plants while responding. Let's say I recognize talent when I see it. And also, he hesitated. Let's say I've been in situations where a little kindness would have made all the difference. Helena felt a lump in her throat. There was sincerity in those words. A vulnerability she didn't expect to see in the reclusive millionaire everyone described. I accept the job, she said finally, but with one condition. Edward raised his eyebrows, waiting. I want our relationship to be strictly professional. No disguised charity, no complications. For an instant, Helena thought she saw a flash of disappointment in his eyes, but it was so quick she could have imagined it. Agreed. Edward extended his hand to seal the agreement. Welcome to the team, Mrs. Fields. When their hands touched, both felt something, a kind of current that had nothing to do with static electricity. Helena withdrew her hand quickly, as if she had been burned. I start tomorrow then? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tomorrow, confirmed Edward. I'll show you the rest of the property another day. For now, I'll ask Martha, our housekeeper, to take you back to town. It's getting late. Helena nodded, grateful for the suggestion. As she followed Edward back to the main house, she couldn't help but notice how he maintained a respectful distance, as if honoring her request even before starting. It was a stark contrast to Paul, who had always tried to control her, suffocate her. On the way back to town, comfortably settled in the leather seat of the car driven by Martha, Helena allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel something like hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life. Not because of Edward Mitchell or any man, but because she had finally had the chance she needed. What she didn't notice was Martha's attentive look through the rearview mirror, nor the slight smile of the housekeeper who knew Edward better than anyone in Flower Ridge. He's never brought anyone to see the dome before, Martha commented casually, breaking the silence. It's his favorite project, you know, his sanctuary. Helena looked out the window, watching the landscape pass by. He seems very dedicated to his work. Martha laughed softly. Dedicated is an understatement. Edward lives for those plants. Since he came back 10 years ago, I've rarely seen him interested in anything else. Came back? Helena couldn't contain her curiosity. Martha seemed to realize she had spoken too much. Yes, he lived away for a while. Family matters. Her tone made it clear the subject was closed. The rest of the trip passed in silence, but Helena's mind was buzzing with questions. Who was Edward Mitchell, really? And why, among all the people in Flower Ridge, had he chosen to help her? The following weeks established a routine that Helena didn't expect to appreciate so much. She woke early, prepared herself carefully, and took the transportation Edward had provided. A simple car with a driver who picked her up every morning and took her back at the end of the day. In the greenhouse, she lost herself in work, rediscovering the passion for plants she had inherited from her mother. The delicate seedlings responded to her care, growing strong and healthy under her attentive hands. Hours passed quickly between pH measurements, temperature and humidity adjustments, and the careful process of acclimating the most exotic species. Edward kept his word about professionalism. Their interactions were limited to brief morning meetings to discuss progress and occasional encounters in the greenhouse corridors. He always treated her with respect, listening attentively to her suggestions and implementing several of them. This professional distance, however, didn't prevent Helena from observing him when he didn't notice. She noticed how Edward spent hours among the rarest plants, talking to them in a low voice as if they were old friends. How his hands, large and apparently so unsuited for delicate work, moved with surprising grace when pruning a branch or transplanting a seedling. How his face transformed when contemplating a newly opened flower, the habitual seriousness giving way to an almost childlike expression of wonder. What Helena didn't know was that Edward also observed her. He saw how she hummed softly to the plants while working, how she truly smiled only when she was alone with the flowers, how, occasionally, she caressed her growing belly with an expression mixed with fear and determination. The first crack in the wall carefully built between them occurred on a rainy afternoon, almost a month after Helena had started working in the greenhouse. The sky had darkened suddenly, and a violent storm had broken over the mountain. Helena was in the most remote section of the dome when she heard a deafening crash, followed by the sound of shattering glass. One of the roof panels had given way under the weight of the rain, letting in water and wind that threatened the most sensitive plants. Without thinking twice, Helena ran to the affected area and began moving the pots away from danger, ignoring the water that soaked her clothes and the glass shards that occasionally cut her arms. That's how Edward found her minutes later, soaked, with small cuts on her arms, frantically moving the most valuable plants to safe areas. "Helena!" he shouted over the noise of the storm. "Leave that! It's dangerous! These orchids won't survive if they're left exposed," she shouted back, continuing her work. Edward hesitated only for a second before running to help her. Side by side, they worked in urgent silence, saving what they could while the maintenance crew struggled to temporarily cover the opening in the roof. When they finally finished, both were completely soaked and exhausted. Helena felt a sudden dizziness and leaned against one of the benches. "Are you okay?" Edward's voice was loaded with concern. "Just a little tired." She tried to smile, but another wave of dizziness made her stagger. Without asking permission, Edward picked her up in his arms, ignoring her weak protests. "You need to dry off and rest, and those cuts need to be treated." Helena wanted to protest, maintain the professional distance she herself had imposed, but she didn't have the strength. She let herself be carried to the main house, where Martha was already waiting with towels and dry clothes. "Take her to the guest room," Edward instructed. "I'll get the first aid kit." Half an hour later, Helena was sitting on the edge of an immense bed, wearing dry clothes that were clearly too big for her, while Edward carefully cleaned the cuts on her arms. "You shouldn't have risked yourself like that," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "They were your plants," she replied simply. "They're just plants, Helena. They can be replaced." His eyes met hers. "You can't." The silence that followed was charged with something neither was ready to name. Edward finished caring for the last cut and stood up abruptly. "Rest a little. I'll ask Martha to bring some tea." When he was already at the door, Helena called, "Edward!" It was the first time she had called him by his first name. "Thank you. Not just for this," she gestured to her bandaged arms, "but for everything." A gentle smile appeared on his face. "Rest, Helena. The orchids are waiting for you." That night marked a subtle but significant change. The wall between them didn't collapse, but a small window opened, allowing each to glimpse something beyond the facade carefully maintained by the other. In town, meanwhile, rumors grew. What had started as whispers about the abandoned woman working for the reclusive millionaire had transformed into increasingly elaborate theories. Some said Helena was just another temporary conquest. Others, that she was manipulating him to guarantee financial comfort. Paul, wounded in his pride and resentful of the way Edward had intimidated him at the market, fed these rumors whenever possible. In his market, he didn't miss the opportunity to insinuate that Saint Helena wasn't as innocent as she seemed. Helena noticed the change in attitudes when she went to town on Saturday to shop. The looks now contained not just curiosity, but open judgment. At the bakery, she clearly heard a woman comment, "She didn't waste time, did she? Barely separated, and already found a rich man to support her." In another time, Helena would have lowered her head and fled from confrontations. But something had changed in her in recent weeks. Maybe it was the newly acquired financial independence, or the confidence that grew as her plants responded to her care. The fact is that, for the first time in a long time, Helena allowed herself to confront. "I have an honest job, Mrs. Watson," she said, turning to the woman who had made the comment. "I work hard every day. And as for what happened in my marriage, maybe you should ask your nephew Paul why he finds it so convenient to deny his own daughter." A stunned silence took over the bakery. No one expected the always discreet Helena to so directly confront one of the town's most respected matriarchs. Helena took her bread, left the money on the counter, and left, feeling her heart beat erratically, but strangely light. She didn't see that. Across the street, Edward was watching the scene with a discreet smile on his lips. Later that day, when she was returning home carrying her purchases, Helena was surprised by a familiar voice calling her name. She turned and saw Mary, her childhood friend, waving animatedly from a table at the Square Cafe. "Helena, how long it's been! Come, sit with me." Hesitant, Helena crossed the street. Mary had moved to the capital years before and rarely returned to Flower Ridge. The two had been inseparable in adolescence, but life had taken them down different paths. "Mary, I didn't know you were in town." Helena smiled, genuinely happy to see a friendly face. "I arrived yesterday for the agricultural fair. I'm representing the laboratory where I work." Mary hugged her warmly, ignoring the looks around them. "My God, you're pregnant. Why didn't you tell me?" The two sat down, and for the next hour, Helena opened up, telling everything that had happened in recent months. The failed marriage, Paul's accusations, the isolation, and finally, the job at the greenhouse. "So you work for Edward Mitchell?" Mary seemed impressed. "He's almost a legend in the region. Did you know he anonymously financed the renovation of the children's hospital in the capital? And paid for several children's treatments without ever revealing his identity?" Helena shook her head, surprised. "How do you know that?" "I work in the hospital's administrative department. We only found out by chance, when an employee recognized the signature on some documents." Mary lowered her voice. "He expressly asked that his name never be mentioned. They say he did the same in several social projects throughout the region." That information brought a new perspective. Helena had always seen Edward as a reserved man, perhaps even a bit arrogant in his seclusion. The idea that he silently helped so many people without seeking recognition contradicted everything she had thought about him. "Why would he do that?" she asked, more to herself than to Mary. "Not everyone who has the ability to help needs applause to do it, Lena." Mary smiled, using the childhood nickname. "Some people simply do what's right." When they said goodbye at the square fountain, Mary added, "Whatever is happening between you two, remember that not all people are like Paul. Some walls need to be torn down, not built. Helena returned home with her friend's words echoing in her mind, along with the new image of Edward that was beginning to form. Winter in the mountains was harsh, with cold mornings that left a thin layer of ice over plants and rooftops. On one of these particularly cold mornings, Helena arrived at the greenhouse shivering, even with the heavy coat she wore. Edward found her adjusting the temperature controls, her fingers visibly red from the cold. "You need gloves," he commented, observing how she blew on her hands trying to warm them. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, the response she had given for years to hide any weakness. Edward didn't respond. He disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a carefully wrapped package. "This arrived last week for the greenhouse. They're special gloves, made for delicate work with plants. I thought you could test them." Helena knew it was a polite lie. The gloves were clearly new and the perfect size for her small hands. Her first impulse was to refuse. Pride was still a difficult barrier to overcome. But the cold was intense, and there was something in Edward's look, an almost imperceptible vulnerability, that made her change her mind. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the package. The relief on his face was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Edward nodded and turned to leave, but Helena called him. "Edward?" She hesitated. "Would you like to have dinner at my house this Saturday? Nothing special, just as thanks for everything." The surprise on his face was genuine. For a moment, Edward seemed truly speechless. Yes, of course. It would be a pleasure. 7 o'clock then?" Helena smiled, feeling a strange lightness in her chest. "I'll make apple pie. Martha mentioned it's your favorite." A shy smile appeared on Edward's normally serious face. "Martha talks too much." That night, alone at home, Helena took a glass jar from the shelf and began preparing homemade apple preserves. The gesture itself was simple, but represented something bigger, a small step toward the trust she hadn't felt in so long. On Saturday, Edward arrived punctually at 7, bringing a small bouquet of wildflowers and evident nervousness that humanized his normally composed figure. "They're beautiful," Helena commented, accepting the flowers. "Where did you find them?" "I thought the frost had finished off the wildflowers." "I have my secrets," he replied with a half-smile. "There are always flowers, if you know where to look." Dinner was surprisingly peaceful. Sitting at the simple table in Helena's small kitchen, they talked about plants, about the upcoming flower festival, about books and music. Edward spoke about his travels around the world in search of rare species, and Helena shared memories of her mother and the garden they maintained when she was a child. "She taught me that each plant has its own personality," Helena told him, serving the apple pie still warm. "Some are stubborn, others generous, some need space, others need company." "And people?" Edward asked, his eyes fixed on her. "Did your mother say anything about people?" Helena smiled, remembering. "She said people are like entire gardens, complex, always changing, sometimes blooming where least expected." When Edward was preparing to leave hours later, there was a new silent understanding between them. They were no longer just employer and employee, nor strangers united by circumstances. They were two people who, slowly, were discovering common ground in unexpected terrain. "Thank you for dinner," he said, standing at the door. "It was the best night I've had in a long time." Helena nodded, feeling the same. When she extended her hand for a formal farewell handshake, Edward hesitated. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he held her hand between his and brought it to his lips, in a light and respectful kiss. "Good night, Helena." She stood at the door for a long time after he left, her hand still warm where his lips had touched, her heart beating in a new and frightening rhythm. The next day, Edward found a jar of homemade apple preserves on his work desk. There was no note, but the meaning was clear. He kept the empty jar for weeks after finishing the preserves, as if it were a precious treasure. As winter gave way to spring, the transformation in Flower Ridge's landscape was almost magical. Fields once covered with frost now exploded in colors, announcing the proximity of the famous flower festival, the most anticipated event of the year. The town came alive with preparations. Streets were decorated, stalls set up, musicians hired. In the Mitchell greenhouses, activity was frantic. This year's presentation promised to be the most spectacular of all, with the exhibition of impossible species that Edward and his team had been cultivating. Helena, now almost 7 months pregnant, worked with even more dedication. The plants she had cared for since they were small seedlings now bloomed magnificently, ready to dazzle visitors. Her prominent belly didn't stop her from spending hours among the beds, adjusting, pruning, talking to her protégés, as she lovingly called them. Edward watched this dedication with growing admiration. In recent months, a subtle transformation had occurred in Helena. The fragile and frightened woman he had found on that rainy morning now walked with confidence, spoke with authority about her work, and even faced the looks and comments when she went to town. The relationship between them had also evolved. After that dinner, small gestures had become part of the routine. A cup of tea left on the work table, a rare flower carefully placed next to her coat, conversations that extended beyond work hours. Nothing had been openly declared, but everyone on the property noticed the change. In the week leading up to the festival, the traditional spring dance would be held in the central square. It was an old event, where couples danced under colored lanterns to the sound of a small local orchestra. Helena didn't plan to attend. The idea of facing the whole town, especially Paul, made her anxious. It was Martha who ended up convincing her. "Are you going to let them keep you trapped at home?" the housekeeper asked, while helping Helena organize some seedlings. "What kind of example would that be for your daughter?" Helena stopped, surprised. "How do you know it's a girl?" Martha smiled, enigmatically. "The way you carry your belly. I had 5 children. I know how to recognize it." She approached, adjusting Helena's apron. "Besides, you always refer to the baby as she when you talk to the plants." Helena blushed, realizing it was true. "Still, I don't know if I'm ready to face all those people. The looks, the comments. And when will you be?" Martha asked gently. "After the baby is born? When she starts school? When they start asking why her mother never appears at events?" Martha's words hit Helena like a shock of reality. She wasn't just living for herself anymore. Soon, she would be responsible for a life that would depend not only on her care, but also on her example. "You're right," she finally admitted. "But I don't have anything to wear that fits in this state." Martha smiled, victorious. "Leave that to me." On the day of the dance, Helena looked at herself in the mirror, almost not recognizing the woman staring back at her. Martha had found a petrol blue silk dress that perfectly embraced her pregnant belly, making her look not just appropriate, but elegant. Her hair, normally tied in a practical bun, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. When the doorbell rang, her heart accelerated. Edward had offered to accompany her, a gesture she had accepted after much hesitation. Now, with him standing at her door, wearing a dark suit that made him look even taller and more imposing, Helena felt a wave of gratitude. "You look—" Edward stopped, apparently speechless. "Huge," Helena joked, trying to hide her nervousness. "Radiant," he corrected, offering her his arm. "Ready?" She nodded, even though she wasn't. But she had learned that some things were worth the risk. The central square was transformed. Colored lanterns hung from strings interlaced between the posts, creating a ceiling of light over those present. Tables with white tablecloths surrounded a central area intended for dancing, where some couples were already spinning to the soft sound of the orchestra. When Helena and Edward arrived, the buzz of conversations visibly diminished. All eyes turned to the unlikely couple, the abandoned pregnant woman and the reclusive millionaire. Helena felt the impulse to retreat, but Edward's hand on her back offered silent support. "Don't give them the power to drive you away," he murmured, guiding her between the tables. "This place is as much yours as theirs." They found an empty table and sat down. Gradually, conversations resumed, although Helena still felt occasional glances in her direction. To her surprise, some people approached to greet them. First, the greenhouse employees, then merchants who did business with Edward, and finally, some neighbors Helena had known since childhood. "See, it wasn't so bad," Edward commented, offering her a glass of fruit juice. Helena smiled, beginning to relax. The music changed to something slower and more romantic, and several people headed to the dance floor. Edward hesitated for a moment, then stood up and extended his hand to Helena. "Would you dance with me?" She looked at the dance floor, then at her prominent belly. "I don't know if I can." "Trust me," he insisted gently. Helena placed her hand in his and allowed him to guide her to the center of the square. Edward held her gently, maintaining a respectful distance that her belly required, but close enough for her to feel his warmth. They moved slowly, almost floating to the sound of the music. Helena was conscious of the looks, but for the first time she didn't care. There was something in that moment, in the soft lights above them, in the perfume of the first spring flowers, in the way Edward looked at her, that made everything else insignificant. "Everyone is looking," she murmured. "Let them look," Edward replied, his gaze fixed on hers. "All I see is you." That's when Paul appeared, visibly altered by alcohol. He stopped a few meters from them, his face contorted by a bitter expression. "What a touching scene," he said loud enough for several people around to hear. Poor Helena finally found a substitute to support the bastard. The music continued, but several couples stopped dancing. Edward felt Helena stiffen in his arms and saw humiliation color her face. But before he could react, she gently moved away from his arms and turned to face Paul. "This bastard, as you call her, is your daughter, Paul." Her voice was clear and firm, without the tremor that usually accompanied her confrontations. "But you know what? Maybe it's better this way. Maybe she deserves a father who values her, not one who denies her out of wounded pride." Paul advanced a step, his face red with anger. "You don't have the right." "I have every right," Helena interrupted, one hand protectively over her belly. "I'm the one carrying her. I'm the one who stayed when you left. And I'll be the one who's there in every moment that matters." A heavy silence fell over the square. Paul looked around, realizing that all expressions now contained not sympathy, but disapproval, directed at him. "This isn't over," he muttered, before walking away, staggering slightly. When he disappeared into the crowd, Helena felt her legs weaken. Edward immediately supported her, guiding her back to the table. "You were incredible," he said, admiration evident in his voice. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Edward replied, holding her hand on the table. "It's doing what needs to be done, despite fear." Helena looked at their joined hands, noticing how they fit perfectly. It was a symbol of what had been happening between them. A gradual approach, imperfect, but genuine. "Can we go?" she asked, suddenly tired. Edward nodded, helping her stand. Before they could leave, Mary appeared, accompanied by several familiar faces. "Don't go now. We were waiting for the right moment to join you." To Helena's surprise, several people she had known since childhood were there, looking at her not with judgment, but with warm smiles. Mary gave her a tight hug. "We're all on your side, Lena. We always have been. Some of us just took a while to find the courage to show it." That night transformed something fundamental in Flower Ridge. The narrative Paul had built began to crumble, and Helena, for the first time, felt truly at home again. When they finally left the party, hours later, she and Edward walked hand in hand under the colored lanterns, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. On the way home, passing through the now almost empty square, Edward suddenly stopped. "What's wrong?" Helena asked. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I realized something tonight," said Edward, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "When Paul approached, my first instinct was to protect you. But you didn't need protection. You defended yourself, with a strength few would have." Helena felt her face warm. "I didn't feel strong. I was trembling inside. Still, you stood firm." Edward took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "That's when I realized I'm not falling in love with the woman I thought needed saving. I'm falling in love with the woman who saved herself." The world seemed to stop. The words hung between them, direct, honest, without possibility of misunderstanding. "Edward, You don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know. No expectations, no pressure, just the truth." Helena felt an overwhelming emotion dominate her chest. In recent months, Edward had become not just her employer or friend, but a constant presence that brought security and, gradually, something deeper. Still, fear persisted. Fear of trusting again, of opening up, of allowing herself to be vulnerable. "I'm so afraid," she confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "Not just for me, but for her." She touched her belly. "I can't make the same mistakes." Edward nodded, understanding. "Fear is part of it." He hesitated, then added, "You're not the only one with scars, Helena." It was the first time he had hinted at his own painful past. The story everyone knew existed, but no one really knew. "Maybe one day we can talk about our scars," she said, finding courage to extend her hand and lightly touch his face. "When we're ready." Edward covered her hand with his, turning his face to kiss her palm in a gesture so intimate that Helena felt tears form in her eyes. "When we're ready," he agreed. That night, he accompanied her to her door and said goodbye with a chaste kiss on her forehead. There were no grandiose declarations or eternal promises, just a silent understanding that something had begun, something fragile and precious that both were determined to protect. The following weeks brought a series of small changes. Edward began dining regularly at Helena's house. Sometimes he brought exotic ingredients and cooked for her, revealing surprising culinary talents. Other times they just talked on the porch until late, watching the stars and sharing stories. On one of those nights, sitting on the porch swing, Helena finally gathered courage to ask about his past. "Why did you return to Flower Ridge? Martha mentioned you were away for a long time." Edward was silent for so long that Helena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was loaded with contained emotions. "I had a family in New York, a wife, Beatrice, and a daughter, Ellie." He paused, breathing deeply. "Ellie was 5 when she got sick. A rare heart condition." Helena held his hand, offering silent support. "We tried every available treatment. I spent fortunes, consulted specialists around the world." His gaze was distant, lost in memories. In the end, nothing was enough. She was gone in less than a year. "I'm sorry," Helena murmured, imagining the pain of losing a child. After that, everything fell apart. Beatrice and I each dealt with grief differently. She wanted to move forward, have other children. I couldn't even think about it. Edward gently squeezed Helena's hand. "We separated less than a year later. She's married again now, has 2 children. She's happy from what I heard. And you came back here?" Edward nodded. "This property belonged to my grandfather. I spent childhood summers here among the flowers. It was the only place where I could breathe after everything. I came intending to stay a few weeks, ended up staying 10 years. Helena then understood the origin of Edward's silent generosity, the anonymous donations to children's hospitals, his interest in helping without being recognized. It was his way of honoring his daughter's memory, of giving meaning to loss. "That's why you keep everyone at a distance," she concluded softly. A sad smile appeared on his face. "I thought it would be safer. Until I found you on that rainy morning." Helena felt the weight of that confession. Edward wasn't just sharing his past. He was revealing why she, specifically, had broken his carefully constructed barrier. "What did you see in me that day?" she asked, genuinely curious. Someone who, like me, knew the pain of losing everything, but unlike me, hadn't given up. His eyes met hers. "You were there, pregnant, publicly humiliated, and still, there was so much dignity in the way you walked away. So much life." Helena didn't realize she was crying until she felt Edward's gentle touch wiping away her tears. "I'm afraid, Edward," she confessed, placing her hand on her belly. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if I can't protect her?" "Fear is natural," he replied. "It means you care deeply. But I know, just watching how you care for each seedling in the greenhouse, that you'll be an extraordinary mother." That night, when he left, Helena sat alone for a long time, reflecting on how 2 people so hurt by life had found in each other not just understanding, but the possibility of a new beginning. The flower festival arrived with all its splendor. The entire town transformed, Streets decorated with elaborate arrangements, music on every corner, stalls with typical foods and local crafts. The event attracted visitors from the entire region, and this year, with the special exhibition from the Mitchell greenhouses, expectations were even higher. The dome, which Helena had helped prepare with such care, was dazzling. The impossible species Edward had imagined, flowers from different seasons and climates blooming together in harmonious arrangements, provoked sighs of admiration from all visitors. Helena walked among the guests, explaining cultivation processes, answering technical questions, clearly in her element. Her prominent belly, now in the 8th month, didn't diminish her energy or enthusiasm at all. In fact, it seemed only to increase her aura of vitality. Edward watched her from afar, marveled by the transformation. That confident, smiling woman who enchanted specialists and lay people with her knowledge was almost unrecognizable compared to the frightened figure he had found in the rain months before. The official inauguration of the exhibition was scheduled for evening. Edward, as host, would make a brief speech before opening the dome to the general public. While preparing, an unusual commotion caught his attention. Paul had arrived, accompanied by 2 men Edward didn't recognize. He seemed sober, but there was something in his expression that set off an alert. Edward discreetly signaled for the nearest security guard to stay alert and continued his preparations. When the time came, a small crowd gathered in front of the dome entrance, where a podium had been installed. Edward adjusted the microphone and began, "Good evening, everyone. It's with great satisfaction that we present the result of more than a year of work." His speech was eloquent, talking about the beauty of diversity, about how apparently incompatible species could flourish together under proper care. He was about to conclude when he did something unexpected, something that wasn't in the planned script. "Before officially opening our exhibition, I'd like to make a special recognition." His eyes found Helena in the crowd. This project wouldn't be possible without the exceptional dedication of Helena Fields, whose sensitivity and knowledge made reality what many considered impossible. A murmur ran through the crowd. Helena felt her face burn as all eyes turned to her. "Helena, could you join me here?" Edward called, extending his hand in her direction. There was a moment of hesitation. Helena had never liked public attention, and after months of being the target of gossip, the idea of going up on that stage was terrifying, but something in Edward's look gave her courage. Slowly, she walked to him, accepting his extended hand. "The rarest flowers," Edward continued, still holding her hand, "often grow in adverse conditions. Their beauty results not from ideal circumstances, but from extraordinary inner strength." It wasn't just about flowers, and everyone knew it. It was a public declaration, a recognition not just of Helena's professional work, but of her personal journey, her resilience. It was Edward telling everyone, without direct words, exactly what he felt for her. At that moment, Paul advanced through the crowd. "How touching," he said loudly, his voice loaded with sarcasm. "The millionaire and his pregnant employee. What an inspiring story." An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. Edward felt Helena stiffen beside him, but before he could intervene, she stepped forward. "Paul, this is neither the time nor the place," she said firmly, but without hostility. "Please respect this event." "Respect?" Paul laughed bitterly. "Is that what we're talking about now? Where was your respect when you decided to humiliate me in front of the entire town?" Edward noticed the 2 men accompanying Paul moving strategically through the crowd, approaching the stage. With a discreet gesture, he alerted his security guards. "Mr. Williams," Edward intervened, keeping his voice controlled. "I suggest you continue this conversation at another time. We're here to celebrate the work of many people." "Of course we are," Paul replied, his face red with contained anger. "Especially her work, right? Everyone in town knows exactly what kind of services she provides in your greenhouses." Several gasps were heard in the crowd. Helena felt as if she had been slapped, but remained firm. "Enough, Paul," she said, her voice tremulous not from fear, but from indignation. "You can try to hurt me all you want, but it won't work anymore. I'm not ashamed of who I am or the work I do." Edward stepped forward, positioning himself partially between Helena and Paul. "I think it's time for you to leave." he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Security guards were already moving toward Paul, who realized his disadvantage. But before being escorted out, he launched one last provocation. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Helena. Men like him get tired quickly. And when that happens, don't think I'll accept that child as mine." While Paul was led away, Edward turned to Helena, concerned about the effect of those cruel words. To his surprise, he found not tears, but a serene expression. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, away from the microphone. Helena nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Do you see what happened?" she murmured, so only he could hear. "He tried to humiliate me again, exactly like that morning in the rain. But this time, it was different. This time, I'm not alone." Edward looked around and saw what she meant. Where before there had been only passive spectators of Helena's humiliation, now there were indignant faces, expressions of support, people approaching to check if she was okay. The community, which had once isolated her, now embraced her. The transformation wasn't just hers, but of that entire small world around her. Edward smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "You'll never be alone again," he promised, before turning to the microphone. "Well, after this small setback, I invite everyone to see our special exhibition." The dome doors opened, revealing the spectacle of colors and aromas awaiting visitors. The tension of the previous moment was quickly replaced by exclamations of admiration and joy. Helena and Edward remained side by side, receiving guests, as hosts, as partners, as something that still didn't have an official name, but that everyone could clearly see. Later that night, when the last visitors had already left, they walked slowly among the flowers, enjoying the silence and each other's company. "You really didn't need to give me public credit," Helena commented, delicately touching one of the rare orchids she had helped cultivate. "It wasn't a favor," Edward replied, observing her profile illuminated by the greenhouse's soft light. "It was recognition. This exhibition is as much yours as mine." Helena turned to him, gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "For giving me space to fight my own battles. For being beside me, not in front of me." Edward approached, closing the distance between them. "It's the least you deserve." There was so much unsaid in those simple words. So much feeling accumulated over the months. Helena felt her heart accelerate when he raised his hand to touch her face, a touch as light as butterfly wings. "Helena, She never knew what he was going to say. At that moment, she felt a sharp and sudden pain in her womb, so intense it made her bend forward with a moan. "What's wrong?" Edward asked, alarmed, holding her by the shoulders. "I don't know, Another wave of pain interrupted her. "Something's wrong." Edward didn't hesitate. In seconds, he was carrying her out of the greenhouse, shouting for help. Martha appeared running, assessing the situation with the calm of someone who had seen similar situations. "Contractions," she diagnosed after some quick questions. "And it looks like your water broke." "This girl is in a hurry." "But there are still almost 2 weeks left," Helena protested weakly, fear evident in her voice. "Babies don't consult calendars, dear," Martha replied with a reassuring smile. "Edward, take her to the hospital in the capital. It's safer than the local clinic, especially for a premature birth." The next minutes were a blur of activity. Edward carried Helena to his car, carefully installing her in the passenger seat. Martha handed him a small suitcase. "I had already prepared this as a precaution," she explained. "It has everything you both will need." While Edward drove along the winding mountain road, Helena fought against the waves of pain that came at increasingly shorter intervals. She grabbed his hand, squeezing it hard with each contraction. "I'm scared," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "What if it's too early? What if she's not ready?" Edward kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was firm and sure. "She's your daughter, Helena. Of course she's ready. She has the strongest mother I've ever known." Those simple words calmed the growing panic in her chest. Helena closed her eyes, concentrating on breathing, as she had learned in childbirth preparation classes. When they arrived at the hospital, everything happened very quickly. Helena was immediately taken to the delivery room, while Edward remained in the waiting room, pacing back and forth, his face a mask of worry. Hours passed. Dawn turned to morning, and Edward was still waiting for news. That's when a nurse appeared, smiling. "Mr. Mitchell, you can come with me. They're waiting for you." Edward followed her through the white corridors to a quiet room. There, Helena was reclined in bed, her face exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle against her chest. When she saw Edward, her face lit up with a smile. "Come meet her," she called softly. Edward approached hesitantly, as if afraid of breaking something precious. When Helena adjusted the blanket, revealing the sleeping newborn's little face, he felt his heart stop for an instant. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "Do you want to hold her?" Helena offered. Edward stepped back, sudden panic evident on his face. "I don't know how. It's been so long." Helena understood immediately. For Edward, holding a baby wasn't a simple act. It was reliving painful memories, facing ghosts that had haunted him for a decade. "It's okay," she said gently. "When you're ready." Edward nodded, grateful for her understanding. He sat on the edge of the bed, observing mother and daughter with an expression that mixed admiration and a deep fear he couldn't name. "What will you call her?" he finally asked. Helena looked at her sleeping daughter, then at Edward. "I was thinking of Flora, because of the flowers that brought us together." "Flora," Edward repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect." They remained silent for some time, sharing that precious moment. It was Helena who finally spoke, her voice soft but determined. "Edward, I need you to know something." She paused, gathering courage. "When Flora grows up and asks about her father, I'll tell her the truth, that Paul is her biological father but never acknowledged her." Edward nodded, understanding the importance of honesty for Helena. "And I'll also tell her," she continued, her eyes fixed on his, "about the man who was by my side during pregnancy, who gave us a new beginning, who taught us that family isn't just a matter of blood." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning and possibilities. Edward felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to offer everything to Helena and Flora, his name, his protection, his love. But he knew they needed time, that certain wounds were still healing. "I'll be here," he promised simply, "for as long as you want, in whatever way you need." Helena extended her free hand to him, which he held between his. "I know you're not ready to hold her now," she said softly, "and that's okay. We have time." The word "we" echoed in Edward's heart like a promise. It wasn't just comfort for the present moment, but a vision of the future. A future that, just a few months ago, he wouldn't have dared imagine. A year later, the Flower Festival returned to Flower Ridge, more exuberant than ever. The town was buzzing with preparations, especially because the Mitchell Greenhouse exhibition promised to surpass the previous years. Helena walked through the central square, holding Flora by the hand. The girl, now 1 year old, took hesitant steps, stopping every few meters to examine a flower or a colorful stone with the intense concentration only children possess. "Mama, Flo!" she exclaimed at each new discovery, pointing to the floral decorations adorning the stalls. "Yes, sweetheart, flowers. Many flowers." Helena smiled, patient. Much had changed in a year. Paul had left town a few months after Flora's birth, selling the market and moving to the capital. Rumors said he had found another woman, that he was rebuilding his life. Helena sincerely hoped it was true. As for her, she continued working at the Mitchell Greenhouses, now as director of the research and development sector. Under her supervision, they had initiated projects for preserving endangered native species and educational programs for schools in the region. And Edward was different. The reclusive and austere man she had met on that rainy morning had given way to someone more open, more present in the community. He had donated land for the local school's expansion, financed the health clinic's renovation, and even begun giving occasional lectures on botany for interested students. But the biggest change wasn't public. It was what happened in private moments, when he, Helena, and Flora were together. Like now, as they walked among the market stalls, Flora between them, holding one hand of each. "Papa, look!" the girl exclaimed, pointing to a particularly colorful arrangement. Edward crouched to her level, examining the flowers with the same seriousness he would analyze a rare species in his greenhouse. "Those are begonias, little one. See how the petals have this special texture?" he explained, guiding her little finger to delicately touch the flower. Helena watched the scene with a full heart. Papa had been Flora's second word, right after Mama. It hadn't been planned or discussed. It had happened naturally, like so many things in their life now. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the year. Edward had begun frequenting Helena's house almost daily, first for brief visits, then for dinners, to help with Flora, to simply be present. There hadn't been a specific moment of decision, just the growing realization that they belonged together. 3 months ago, when Edward had finally found courage to hold Flora for the first time, Helena had known the last barrier had fallen. Seeing him with the girl in his arms, his eyes shining with fear and love, had been the moment she allowed herself to admit what she had known for a long time. They were building a family. Now, as Edward lifted Flora onto his shoulders so she could better see the square's decoration, Helena felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost left her breathless. Life wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days, still pains not completely healed. But there was also this, moments of pure joy, of belonging, of love that grew not from fairy tales, but from daily choices and small acts of courage. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked, noticing her distant look. "About how we got here," she replied honestly. "About all the choices that brought us to this moment." Edward held her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Do you know what I learned this year? That sometimes the most difficult path is the only one worth taking." Flora swayed her little legs on his shoulders, completely oblivious to the adults' conversation, pointing excitedly at the colored lanterns beginning to be lit as evening fell. "And how do you know if it's worth it?" Helena teased, already knowing the answer. Edward smiled, that smile that was still rare, but that lit up his entire face when it appeared. "When I look at you two, I have no doubts." The square was filling up as night fell. The traditional dance would soon begin, repeating the ritual that, the previous year, had marked a decisive moment in their lives. But this time, there was no fear or hesitation, just the expectation of another night under the stars, another memory to be built. "We should go home," Helena suggested, noticing Flora yawning. "She'll fall asleep soon." "Home," Edward repeated, as if savoring the word. "That reminds me. I have something to ask." He gently placed Flora on the ground and took a small box from his pocket. Helena felt her heart race when he knelt before her, right there, in the middle of the crowded square. "Edward, what are you doing?" she whispered, suddenly conscious of the looks turning toward them. "Something I should have done long ago." He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a blue stone. "Helena Fields, you taught me that life can flourish in the most unlikely places. That love doesn't need to be perfect to be true. That family is something we build together, day by day. Would you give me the honor of becoming my wife?" Helena looked at Edward kneeling, at Flora who watched curiously, at the smiling faces around them. She saw in them no longer judgment or gossip, but genuine shared joy. She thought about the long journey that had brought them there, the tears, the discoveries, the small daily victories. "Yes," she replied simply, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I do." When Edward put the ring on her finger and stood up to kiss her, the square erupted in applause. Flora jumped excitedly between them, not completely understanding what was happening, but infected by the moment's joy. It was the transformed echo of the first scene. Before, she walked alone in the rain, invisible and humiliated. Now she was in the center of the square, under the starry sky, surrounded by affection and respect, with her daughter and the man who had learned to love not despite the scars, but with them. And everyone in Flower Ridge, even the most skeptical, knew this wasn't a fairy tale. It was proof that, even after so many falls, love can flourish, as long as someone is willing to do the unthinkable. Believe again. If this story touched your heart like flowers that resist the storm, share it. True love, the kind that is born not from perfection, but from the courage to begin again, deserves to be told.